My name's Helen Mansfield, I'm the principal here. It's great to see so many people here for this evening's talk, which I think is going to be a very exciting one, which is why you've all showed up at 5:30 on a Friday evening, late in the term, so that's wonderful. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, who is Professor Leah DeVun. She's a professor of history and women's gender and sexuality studies at Rutgers University in the United States. And her most recent book is called The Shape of Sex, Nonbinary Gender from Genesis to the Renaissance, at a time when some people suggest this is all a new made-up fad. It's great to hear somebody giving us some historical perspective, and Leah's going to speak for about 40 minutes and then we'll have some questions. So thank you very much, Leah.
Great. Thank you so much. And I thank Helen for that introduction, and also want to thank Matt Cook for the invitation to come out here, and for everyone who facilitated my visit and organized. It's really such an honor to be part of this public lecture series, and an honor to be able to be here and be in conversation with you. And yes, thanks for coming out on Friday night to be here. So appreciate it very much. All right, I'm just going to jump in. Let's see. Okay. And I'm going to jump in because I think the stakes for LGBTQ history right now are extremely urgent, and the stakes are high. In the United States, where I live and work, right now the Supreme Court is deliberating a ban on gender-affirming care for transgender youth. Probably as many of you have heard about, hundreds of anti-LGBTQ bills are being enacted or proposed across the United States, including Don't Say Gay laws, Don't Say They laws, bathroom bills. The National Park Service recently removed references to trans and queer people from its website, indeed from the National Stonewall Monument website, erasing queer and trans history in response to an executive order that probably also many of you have heard about, an executive order that constrains sex and gender to biology. A binary that is drawn between just two sexes, male and female, as recorded on a birth certificate and not able to be changed. And efforts to codify sex and gender in this way as binary appear not just in the executive order, but in policy papers by US evangelical Christian and Catholic groups. And some of these policy papers draw on this idea of binary sex and gender as coming from the biblical book of Genesis and the Christian idea that God created humans distinct as male and female. And these policy statements also include recent characterizations of transgender practice as being a threat to God's creation, or even, we hear, to human dignity. So in some ways, this is a new chapter in LGBTQ politics and history, and much of this hinges on the idea that transgender, gender transition, non-binary gender, that all of these are new, and hence newly a threat. But in other ways, as I'm going to argue today, this is not so new after all. And that these contests resonate with a much earlier history of power struggles over sex and gender, their relationship to the body politic, and indeed to human dignity. Okay, so I'm going to take us all the way back to the Middle Ages. It might not seem so obvious that this is where to go right now, but I'm going to argue, I'm going to look at the Middle Ages between the years of about 200 and 1400 for me in Europe, and I'm going to take us back to a moment when the whole cast of authorities, people like theologians and lawyers, medical professionals, alchemists, poets, all kinds of different people talked about individuals who, because of their bodies or their behavior, they referred to as people who were both sexes. Or they said these people were neither sex. Or sometimes they called them androgynes. This is a word that means a man-woman. But this language isn't straightforward from our point of view in the 21st century. They were talking about people who we would now call intersex, They were talking about people who were, in their view, crossing between genders, who we might put in a transgender history umbrella. And then they were also talking about people whose sexuality was inverted or deviant. So people who we might put into a history of queerness or same-sex sexuality. But these were all people who didn't fit into a simple category of maleness or femaleness for a bunch of different reasons. So what I'm going to explain today is contests about just this idea about sexual binaries or non-binaries emerged out of contests and efforts by these specific people in Christian Europe who were trying to organize their society. So I'm going to argue that binary sex is a historical phenomenon. It's something that changes over time. It's not something that's natural or inevitable, something that's just always been with us. I'm going to also argue that this history is not something that's only important to transgender people or non-binary people, that this history is significant because ideas about non-binary sex and gender were an incredibly important intellectual tool that authorities used to organize all kinds of aspects of their society, their natural world, religious world, geographic world, political world. And they used these ideas to create hierarchies among humans and to make claims about what kind of people were allowed to be accepted into the human community, and hence to then be protected from violence and harm. This work is all a part of queer and trans and intersex history, but I'm going to use the words non-binary gender and non-binary sex to talk about my subjects for reasons that I'm going to explain just a little bit later. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? Okay, I'm going to organize this around some images, and I'm going to start by looking at how medical writers and natural philosophers, which is a kind of fancy way that we talk about early scientists, how they came around in 13th century Europe to deal with just these ideas about the biology of sex differentiation and whether sex is binary or non-binary. I'm going to follow them with another group of arguments which express negative moral opinions about non-binary sex and gender, and that mobilize them as a weapon, as something to dehumanize groups, to scapegoat them, and to argue that they don't belong in society. They belong elsewhere, and they might be harmed. It's a history that's kind of heavy. I mean, it's heavy in the past, and its ramifications in our present moment, are distressing. So I'm going to try to give us a little relief, too, by turning to some idealized ideas about non-binary sex and gender, including a non-binary Jesus, non-binary Adam and Eve, and a host of holy gender transitioning saints. So hang on for that. Then I'll reflect a little bit about what a deep history of ideas about non-binary sex and gender might mean for us today during this critical moment for trans lives and trans history. Okay. So we're going to begin in the mid-12th century. So this is when medical authors in Europe, writing in Latin, were writing texts just to answer these questions about what is the nature of sex and how do humans acquire their sex before they're born. So one representative piece of writing, this is from a work called On Sperm. It began circulating in the mid-12th century and into the 13th century here in England and also in France. And I just have a brief excerpt from it. And it's about how sex differentiation happens at the moment of conception. So it says, if the sperm falls into the left part of the uterus, the infant will transform into a female nature. Then if the man's sperm prevails over the woman's sperm in the left part, the infant will turn into the female sex, but retain certain masculine traits, such as hairiness, a beard, a deep voice, etc. And the female sperm can be so weak that a child of both sexes is created. So according to this and other texts that share this view, what you'll notice is sex exists across a continuum here, with masculine men at one pole and feminine females at the other pole, but then additional sexes in between, right? Masculine females, feminine males, and in the center, this infant of both sexes. So these are intersex individuals. They're called in some texts hermaphrodites, which is, it's a derogatory term now, but it's used in these texts in this time period. And this is the idea that the infant of both sexes has male and female traits in equilibrium. Okay, so the text argues that that the sperms come together. So this is a time period when the medical Facts are that men and women both have sperm, and they release it, and then the sperms kind of like battle it out for dominance. So whichever sperm wins, that's the sex of the infant. Okay, so the other thing that's happening here, I don't have a pointer, but do you see that this is a diagram of the human uterus here? And the idea is that the embryo can fall into it's one of 7 chambers in the uterus. So imagining that the female uterus has 7 chambers in it during this time period. And there's 3 chambers on the right, and if the embryo goes in one of those, it'll be male. 3 chambers on the left, over there it'll be female. And then there's a central chamber at the top. Can you see it? And if the embryo goes in there, it's going to be that child of both sexes, right? The thing to notice here is whatever the decisive factor is in this differentiation, the difference between male and female it's a matter of degree and continuity, right? Intermediate sexes, like masculine women, feminine males, they're not against nature. They're not considered monstrous. They don't provoke any particular disgust or moral opprobrium from the authors. They're just kind of there. But this sexual spectrum model is going to get like a rival for it in the 13th century. And that's a shift I'm going to represent with this text. This is a 13th century text by a scholar named Albert the Great. You ever heard of Thomas Aquinas? Okay, his teacher, okay? So he's a scholar. He writes this huge and influential work around 1263. And you can see this is a manuscript copy of it, and it's got these things called marginalia, like little drawings around the sides of it. So we got this one that's like a monster hybrid. It's kind of like a lion with a human head, right? Over here we've got a hyena. That's going to become important later. And up here, we have an illustration of what's supposed to be an intersex person. And indeed, that's going to be part of what he wants to argue about. So what he argues is a total sea change from what we read in On Sperm. Albert argues that a truly intermediate sex among higher animals is an impossibility. Okay, for him, among higher animals, which includes humans, lower animals like plants, insects, certain lower creatures can be of a non-binary sex. But as creatures go in kind of a hierarchy from the lowest ones to the highest ones, their sexual distinction becomes firmer and firmer. So humans at the top have the most sexual differentiation, the most firm sexual binarism. So Albert was influenced by newly available Latin translations of Greek and Arabic texts, especially texts by Aristotle. So these come available in Latin Europe. People read them, and they're like the hot new thing. They're like, people are like excited about reading Aristotle. And it shapes views of people like Albert the Great. So he writes that intersex people are really male or female. Their shape of their body obscures their underlying sex, but a good doctor is going to be able to do an expert examination and figure out what the underlying male or female sex is. Whereas texts like On Sperm identified an intermediate or non-binary sex as less common but no less natural, one of many different sexes that were possible in a multi-sex spectrum. For Albert, non-binary sex doesn't exist. Male and female differ from each other, not in degrees, but in kind. There's, for him, really a solid break between male and female, and there's nothing in between them. Beyond that, Albert describes even the appearance of in-between in people who are intersex, who he calls hermaphrodites. He calls them against nature, against what nature intended to do. Other people write of intersex people during this time period as monstrosities. And we get expressions of disapproval or kind of moral disgust that we don't get in those 12th century texts. People calling non-binary sex unclean or an abomination, something from which nature recoils. So returning to that manuscript image, I think that we can really see this kind of ambivalent tone, right? We've got this intersex person who's up against these monsters and animals in the text. And after Albert's theories begin to spread far and wide, people begin to deny the existence of a non-binary category between male and female. And non-binary sexes start to get associated with non-humans and lower creatures. But I want to also point out that these are two different groups looking at human bodies and seeing really different biological facts, right? Okay, during the same time period, we find another cluster of arguments that really expresses negative moral opinions about non-binary sex, and particularly in Christian texts that accuse Jewish and Muslim communities of being neither fully male nor female, and that these kind of polemics that accuse Jews and Muslims of being gender crossers or non-binary are used to dehumanize them and to rationalize their displacement from territories and violence against them. So this is like a real use of non-binary sex as a weapon to scapegoat and to say, you don't belong in our community. Okay, so the example I'm going to use is an example of a non-binary figure that appears on the Hereford world map. So this figure in the middle here, it's a figure of a person with a turban who scholars generally identify as a depiction of a Muslim figure. It says that on the Hereford world map, which was made in about the year 1300 and put on public display in Hereford Cathedral. And it's still there. It's a big map. It's like yay big. You can take the train up there and see it. It's still, see, some of you have even done so. It's there on display now. So all the way over at the edge of the map is what we're looking at. So this figure is bilaterally divided. I don't know how well you can see it, but the figure is illustrated so it's got female anatomical features on one half and male on the other half. Figure is depicted as a member of this group of different kind of monstrous figures that are called the monstrous races, and I'll explain that more in just a second. And then they're placed all the way over at the edge of the map. Can you see where that red is like almost off the map? Alongside the Nile River in an area that is inscribed as Ethiopia, so in Africa. Okay, the monstrous races. So this is a legend that's been around for a long time, since the ancient world, but the way that it generally goes is Europeans imagine that outside of Europe, generally into them faraway places like Africa or Asia or just in the East, there existed these kind of quasi-human tribes of people who had extraordinary bodies and kind of extraordinary customs or behavior. And there's a lot of kind of different ranges of monstrous races, but there's some kind of usual suspects. So we've got people with the heads of dogs, for instance, people with no heads at all, for instance, but with faces on their backs or their stuff. I don't know, I always include this one. I really like it. I don't know why. I think it's maybe this guy here. I don't know why he's so unhappy, but anyways. Okay, so among these monstrous races was almost always a dual-sexed race of people, sometimes called hermaphrodite or androgyny. And they were imagined in just that way as that Muslim figure that we saw at the beginning, bilaterally split. So physically, they're imagined to be both male and female at the same time, right, anatomically, so non-binary sex. But they were also imagined in the legend to switch back and forth between male and female gender roles, behaving like a man at once and then switching and behaving like a woman afterwards. You can kind of see that in that image up there that's bilaterally divided, but kind of has like the masculine tool of a sword on one hand, and those are scissors on the other, kind of a domestic tool on the other. But they also were, a part of the legend was that their sexuality was inverted too, that they had sex like a man and then switched and had sex like a woman. So there's the sex, gender, and sexuality kind of all wrapped up in this legend. And the legend had a geographic element too. So this is a different world map. This is the Mara Historiara map. And here, the three continents of Asia and Africa are divided by this V-shaped river from the continent of Europe over here on the right. So we can see some of these monstrous race characters, right? We've got the dog-headed people here. We've got some cyclops. Those are those blemiers up there with the no heads. And then here in the center are these kind of Janus-faced dual-sex people, right? These are these androgyny here in the center. But all of these monstrous races that exist in Asia and Africa are depicted as, nude and kind of animalistic, right? And clearly at a total distinction from the kind of civilized, clearly differentiated and clothed members of society over here in Europe on the right. So this is what's being invoked in that character of the Muslim bilaterally divided figure on the Hereford map. Wait, I have to find my spot here. And there's a lot of ambivalence about these monstrous races. Sometimes they're accepted as human, but sometimes they're imagined to be non-human or kind of existing in a liminal space between human and non-human. And that could be directed at other groups too. For instance, in this virulently anti-Jewish image from a bestiary manuscript. So bestiaries were really popular animated guides to animals. So they taught lessons about animals, but were really about moral lessons for humans based on animal examples. And the animal here is intended to be a hyena. You can see the hyena is really very threatening and demonic, tearing into a nude human corpse here, and depicted in a really sexually explicit way as well. And it goes with a long passage of text that compares hyenas to Jewish people and describes them as being sometimes male, sometimes female, and being neither man nor woman. The language of the text also calls Jewish hyenas unclean, bestial, and has this rhetoric again of crossing back and forth between genders. So that, along with this explicit depiction of sexual features, brings to mind that non-humanness and that foreignness of the monstrous races. So here we have portraits of Jews and Muslims as monsters, as both sexes at the same time, as switching back and forth between male and female gender, tapping into these long-standing ideas about non-binarity as being less than human, and those who are not clearly and fully distinct as male and female as being outsiders, people who are not like us, right? People who are somewhere else, something else, belonging somewhere that's not in our territory. Descriptions of them as unclean, as an abomination, as subhuman. So this is emerging in multiple areas of thought during this time period, and it's not just an intellectual issue. This kind of scapegoating of putting people outside has real human consequences during the period. Scholars now look at that dehumanizing image of the hyena, and they think of it as a real contributor to a hostile climate of anti-Judaism that led to massacres of Jewish communities in the 12th and 13th centuries, and also the expulsion of Jewish communities from the Kingdom of England in 1290, at the end of the period. Similarly, with the Muslim figure on the Hereford map, the map is considered to be also propaganda against Muslims in the time of the Crusades, right? And especially in the wake of the defeat of the Crusader kingdom of Acre during this time period. So these images have a real impact on real people. Okay, let's switch tacks for a minute. Because I want to turn to a very different set of representations of non-binary sex and gender. And I want to emphasize that these images show us that non-binary sex and gender wasn't always something to be denigrated, not always something to be expelled or corrected. Indeed, it could be something that was an ideal. So I want to turn us to images of non-binary sex and gender and late antique Christianity. So that's the beginning of the period that I'm talking about. And it comes in the form of speculation that Adam, so this is the first human imagined in the biblical creation story, that Adam was created not distinct as male and female, but as a non-binary creature, as an androgyne, or that's that man-woman word. Someone who was undifferentiated in sex, and that undifferentiation was perfect in its simplicity, its lack of division, and its closeness to the divine. So I want you to remember that some of those those Christian polemics that I was just talking about at the beginning invoke the language of the Bible, right? Distinct as male and female as a rationale for their politics. But it turns out that people didn't always read those words in the Bible to mean that, right? They interpreted them very differently. And instead, they argued that the original intended state of humanity as it was created by God was actually non-binary, right? The original untainted human is non-binary, and it's only after the fall into sin that humans become split into binary male and female forms. Right? This is the debate that they were having. Now, of course, that doesn't become the orthodox interpretation of the creation story over the years, but it turns out that people keep repeating this non-binary creation story over and over again, and we find it cropping up again and again for over 1,000 years in all different kinds of literature and testimony, and it also appears in visual art. So from the 8th century on, we have images of Adam and Eve as being totally similar to each other, undifferentiated, very symmetrical, not able to tell the one from the other. And we find it in images that even fuse Adam and Eve together into a single kind of biform figure. So this is from a 12th century commentary on the creation story. And lest you think I'm not saying they are labeled as Adam and Eve. Okay, so we can see Adam and Eve here have got 2 heads and 2 sets of arms, right? But they're joined at the waist into a single figure that's both male and female at the same time, or at least defies any kind of simple notion of being distinct as male and female. They share a body from the waist down, and they have this kind of Y-shaped composition. They've got a belly that's kind of swollen. I feel like it's kind of pregnant looking, and no discernible genitals whatsoever, right? So this Y-shaped composition is really important. It's not an accident. We find it in a ton of different kinds of images of the creation across a wide range geographically and across time period. And they share with them a composition that was commonly used at the time to represent so-called hermaphroditism or androgyny. So I've just got a couple of examples here for us to look at. The first over here on this side is from Ovid's poem Metamorphoses, right? So Ovid describes the myth of the creation of the hermaphrodite, happens in Salmacis' Spring, and that's what's being depicted here. We have the moment where the mythic hermaphrodite is created from Salmacis and Hermaphroditus, but we see that Y-shaped formation, right? Split at the top, but joined there at the torso and sharing a form that, again, kind of defies a binary. Over here is an image of what was considered alchemical androgyny, right? The same kind of fused together a biform sort of figure. This was imagined to be a transcendence of maleness and femaleness in a physical form. So when people showed Adam and Eve in that Y-shaped iconography, they were making reference to these currents of a non-binary story that was included in the creation. And it's not just Adam and Eve. We've got non-binary Jesus. So these images are alchemical images of so-called alchemical hermaphrodites. Because they're alchemical texts, we've got Antichrist hermaphrodite on one side and Jesus, Mary hermaphrodite on the other side. It's a long story, so I can talk about it more if you want later. But what I want you to notice with the Jesus, so-called Jesus hermaphrodite here, is it's got that Janus-faced dual sex, right, monstrous race kind of look to it, right? This is Jesus and Mary in one form, and it's hinting at the idea that Jesus is kind of the ultimate non-binary figure, right? Human and divine at the same time, mortal and immortal, male and female, and the idea that Jesus sort of transcends any sort of simple category. And these alchemical figures fit into a long tradition of medieval representations of Jesus as being androgynous, feminized, or combining male and female qualities in some way or another. So we find images of Jesus as very androgynous or feminine in a number of works of church art. I just have two here. This one's from the Stonecutters Monastery, which is in Greece. And this one over here used to be called the Seated Poetess, now the Teaching Christ, now housed in Rome. But the idea is that these images of Jesus were so feminine that for a long time art historians thought that they were depictions of women. Beyond this, there were a number of medieval writers, and some of them really well known, people like Aelred of Rievaulx or Bernard of Clairvaux, who talked about Jesus as having breasts, who described Jesus as having a womb, who described Jesus as actually breastfeeding. Jesus appears in certain devotional texts as a washerwoman or a seamstress, or doing things that were associated at the time with women. So in behavior that was really gender nonconforming. And as promised, there was a robust tradition of saints who transitioned, usually from female to male. There's not one, there's not two, there are dozens of these gender-crossing saints. You can look it up, there's lots of work done on them, but I just bring us one who is Eugenius. So Eugenius, by legend, was raised as the daughter of a Roman aristocrat, goes ahead and converts to Christianity, enters a monastery as a man, and then goes on to live like an exemplary life as a male monk, even rising to be the leader of the monastery. And it's again, these stories get kind of complicated, but I just want to note that there's lots of medieval and early modern art that depicts these gender transitioning saints. And you can see from the manuscript over there and here in this kind of church monumental sculpture that they're comfortable showing a holy individual with both male and female traits at the same time in these images. And the treatment of these images and the saints themselves was, they're saints. It's overwhelmingly positive, right? Even if people weren't supposed to follow them in their gender transition, they were held up as people who were in God's favor. And their lives were considered to be miraculous. So the basic point I want to make here is that ideas about sex and gender beyond a binary, beyond divisions of male and female, they weren't always slated for erasure, not always slated to be expelled or corrected. Non-binary sex and gender could be embraced by Christian tradition, could be embraced as ideal, as pure, as perfect, and as kind of originary. Okay. I think there's a general collective assumption, and I mean the general public, but I also mean LGBTQ community people. I think there's this general idea that that the emergence of non-binary gender categories, that are contests that we're having about them, are more or less new, right? And so I struggled to find like an example of public opinion. Apologies, but I used X, Twitter. So if we just give it a quick perusal, we'll see, for some people, the newness means that they find it to be particularly threatening to traditional gender, even to human dignity, as we've heard. For others, it's not about that. They're not hostile. It's just they're historicists, and it's the term non-binary that's the problem. It's when we use it to describe past individuals or past gender concepts, it's an anachronism. That is, it's a modern term that we're imposing on cultures that wouldn't have had it, and it doesn't belong there. But part of what I want to do by putting our current discussions about non-binary gender practice, about embodiment, into a much longer framework is to show that non-binary categories aren't actually so new after all, and that tradition, even Christian tradition, could have them as a part of it. My work wouldn't be possible without groundbreaking work by transgender historians, intersex historians, queer historians. But as I said already, I use the language of non-binarity, and I use it for a particular reason. because it's the language that people used at the time to describe their own system of sex and gender. So I just have this one example here. This is from a notarial manual from the 13th century. It's by this guy Rolandino. Looks a little doubtful about the whole situation, but he's, so this is a practical manual, and he's talking about an intersex person, and for practical purposes, a notary needs to put an intersex person into a social category of male or female, so a social category related to sex. We would call that gender, right? Social category related to sex. And he's talking about a binary division and then someone who's not binary to fit into this notarial system. So he's talking about binary and non-binary gender, basically in those terms in the 13th century. So this isn't a concept that people didn't have in the past, and it's not an anachronism to talk about a long history of non-binary gender to go far back beyond our, our present time. So why take this all the way back to the Middle Ages? One of my chief goals in tracing this over a long chronology is to show that this preference for binary sex, this idea that there's only male and female, they're the only natural, legitimate, desirable sexes that humans can belong to, that this is something that waxes and wanes over time. It's not a natural, inevitable division of humankind, something that's always been with us, something that's just common sense, right? It goes in and out of fashion over time. I think it's for sure important that when we look to the past and we see some sex and gender variant ideas and practices that mirror our own right now, I think it's incredibly important. For queer and trans people, some of us have been rejected by our families, and so seeing people in the past and being able to forge a kind of sense of kinship or community across time it's really meaningful. If you saw those gender transitioning saints and you were like, yay, it is a delight, and it's important to have that delight. And I think especially so when we see them fitting into a culture when non-binary categories and gender transition weren't necessarily vilified, right? Weren't necessarily rejected, but sometimes included and embraced and even idealized. Beyond this, although I don't think we need history to legitimate queer and trans people's right to live now, I do think we have to recognize that history is an incredibly powerful legitimating force, and people who make human rights arguments, people who make activist arguments, often rely on the argument that a community that has a past has a right to exist in the present, right? Has a right to exist in the future. So I think as historians, we have an important role in providing that kind of evidence to make those historical arguments work in activist and human rights circles. And LGBTQ history really matters right now. As we can see, we've got the erasure of state records of transgender and queer history happening right now. We see it with the Stonewall National Monument case and even additional cases since I put together this PowerPoint. Meanwhile, in the US versus Skermeti case, the Supreme Court case that I began with at the beginning of my talk, an amicus brief in it cites multiple scholarly histories of LGBTQ life to argue that gender transition and gender nonconformity are a longstanding part of human history, right? Not something that's brand new. So trans history and non-binary history, they have a role to play in contests that are happening right now, including how court cases get decided, how historical memory is preserved, and how lives get lived right now. And I think we have a lot to gain from looking at the past and seeing people who, more or less looked and lived and thought much like us. But I want to argue that we gain a lot from a past that's totally unfamiliar, that shows us something that's radically different from the way that we think, right, and the way that life looks to us now. And the medieval period is great for showing us a radical difference, right? It's really strange, it's foreign, it's confusing. That is really weird. right? I mean, like, this stuff is weird even to those of us who study it, right? You know, and I would even call it unsettling. And I think that unsettling feeling is a hugely important part of the project of history, right? Because when we look at the past and we see how much things have changed since then, I think that we can get a sense of how much things are going to continue to change in the future, right? And when we see that this disorientation can also like kind of shake our certainties that we have the facts, we know what's right in the present, right? That the biological facts are this. I mean, the people that I'm talking about, they were the utmost experts of their own time period. The biological facts that they are describing, you know, those were the latest, most cutting edge knowledge during their time period. So I think that can help to disorient us and make us think maybe the biological facts that we have now aren't the ones that are going to continue to be around in the future. And having that kind of like radically different sense of that possible future, I think also helps us to imagine radically different futures for ourselves too. Laws that exclude trans people from civil society and public space, that are limiting health care, proposing bans on books, curricula, research, all mentioning trans and queer people. This is all happening right now in the US, and it indicates that the struggles of LGBTQ communities of all genders are extremely urgent and real right now, and they demand our attention, they demand our international attention right now. And these struggles go to the heart of what we mean by human dignity. So while I'm not offering any simple equations between pre-modern and modern people, I am arguing that we can better grasp the historical force and the complexity of the sex and gender categories that are being used right now to organize our social, our cultural, our political, our educational worlds, and that we can imagine a world of better radical change and difference in the future by understanding this long history. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Leah. That was absolutely terrific talk. And when I was looking at those images, what I was wondering was whether you, from your research, have any sense that people were more comfortable with strangeness in the Middle Ages, or whether, you know, those, I mean, it's interesting that it's Asia and Africa are these people with no heads or people who are dogs. Right. You know, you're othering in a very big way. Yeah. But do you think people were more comfortable with not knowing things, or?
More comfortable with strangeness and not knowing things? I mean, you know, some people have argued that, you know, that there's kind of like an appreciation for alterity or otherness in the Middle Ages. And for sure, otherness is something that they did tend to, in certain cases like these, imagine as elsewhere or far away or push away. But, you know, for these talks, we kind of simplify a little bit. But I will say that sometimes when they were talking about these other places and these bisexed people, they immediately turned to talking about Europe and their own community and things that resonated with that, intersex people or non-conforming people within their own community. So I think they were able to kind of think about strangeness and difference, not only being as something as pushed away, but also the kind of strangeness within their own community, right? And the idea that they themselves might also include all kinds of strangeness and kind of foreignness within.
Yeah. I can see such a full room and so little time that I'm going to not restrain myself. I usually ask loads of questions. It's not fair. So I'm going to start off. I'm just going to open it up because I just know there's going to be all sorts of. Yeah, a hand here and then a hand here. So hang on. Can you just wait for the microphone? Thank you. It's okay. And then here.
Excellent. I noticed something interesting when you were talking about the comparison between hyenas and Jewish people. They're both considered matriarchal. And so that kind of clicked something in my brain, where I also noticed you were talking about the change happening between the early 11th and 12th century into the 13th and 14th, which also kind of aligns with something I'm studying in the lower northern countries between those time periods when women were having a lot more freedom in the cities.
Fascinating.
And it started shifting around the same time, the 14th and 15th centuries, where those rights and women's freedom to work was being taken away and being repressed towards the Renaissance period. So it just really fascinated me that there's sort of it seems like a connection between repressing women and this need to solidify genders into a binary. So I thought that was really fascinating. I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really helpful, and I think it keys into, this, where we do see sort of non-binary or, these kind of genders beyond being dismissed or kind of denigrated, it's not just non-binarity, it's anything that deviates from masculinity, right? And so, women are the major form of pollution here and kind of clerical reform. I mean, there's all kinds of, as you say, kind of legal prescriptions on women in power. And so a bunch of this comes to be like these non-binary figures are like women, not full men, right? And so we see those kinds of, real exercises of power and property being rationalized with like these cultural images that try to shore up masculinity and deviation from it as being a threat to the community. Yeah, I think that that's great.
Hello. I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much. But could I please recommend you are very careful where you shout about historical equation with Muslim people and trans people, because I think if the president or vice president heard that, they'd really run with it, and we don't want that.
Yeah.
Secondly, I wanted to ask about the trans saints, and I wondered if you had any insight or opinion about why there were far more female to male saints than there were male to female saints.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll say, I think like rhetoric that denigrates Muslims, for a long time during this period, does really pull together ideas about deviant sexuality, right? A kind of a feminization or kind of sodomizing like Muslims as a sort of, they're not real men like we are kind of thing. And obviously these kinds of arguments have valence far beyond this period, right, into sort of colonial discourse and of course discourse not just directed at Muslims but indigenous people in the New World. So I mean you're right that that power relations and oppression of groups sometimes are worked out in the areas of sex and sexuality, right? Well, I mean, I think the thing with the trans saints goes back to the previous question that I mean, masculinity is an ideal, right? And so, I'm not saying that this is across all of the saints' lives, because there are some cases where femininity or kind of a woman Christ figure is idealized, but often for these saints, moving towards masculinity is also kind of ascending, in a hierarchy to a greater state of kind of like, like heroic sanctity. So I think that that's a part of it too. I mean, there's great work done on all the ins and outs of these trans saints. I mean, they're all different individuals and they have different legends, although there's some kind of tropes that appear across many of them. So I wouldn't want to generalize exactly, but that is a part of it also. And some of them are saintly because they're women who are trying to get out of marriage, and so they kind of turn into men so that they don't have to get married, right? So there's that too. I mean, I really recommend reading and learning about them. I mean, I think it's a very prevalent part of kind of the medieval saints tradition. I mean, Joan of Arc read these transitioning saint stories, and they were formative for her. But I think it's not a really well-known history anymore. It's kind of been lost.
Okay, and then hand it along to Peter.
Thanks. It works. The thing that characterizes what's going on at the moment is that there is this process of seeing this as something which is, on the one hand, radical and liberating, and on the other hand, the other side of the culture war, so-called, is that it's demonized.
Yeah.
And that it's central. It's informing social policy. It's in the public discourse. It's talked about in pubs and workplaces.
Absolutely.
And in your historical research, have you found other time periods where this kind of thing ceased to be obscure and specialized and became a part of a dominant discourse, or is it not possible to find that out?
Explain what you mean by dominant discourse, because it really is part of the discourse that's making up kind of the values of the church and kingdom in this kind of, even if they're kind of small mentions.
I'm wondering if there were times where it became the hot topic.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking, I don't think she's here actually, my colleague Helen Lacey, who does work about women and sort of poorer people in the Peasants' Revolt in the 14th century.
Yeah.
But their voices are not necessarily heard. So if you see what the church is writing, you may not know what was happening in villages, whether it was normal to be a person who wasn't seen as either particularly female or male or not living in your gender role, if you were poor or not literate, I guess. Is that...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to that end of things, I mean, there were certainly people in villages who seemed to have escaped any particular censure, right, for being intersex or for not fitting into these categories. I mean, it's somewhat to the extent that in the book that this talk is based on, I argue that considering the quite coercive surgeries that happen on intersex infants now, that there could have been a much more sort of like accepting and kind of like forgiving of biological morphic differences during that period than even we have now, right? So I think that that's true as well. But in terms of the dominant discourse being like hinged on ideas about sex and gender and like how people fit into categories, has it ever not been? I mean, for sure, during the long period that I look at, there's kind of like a delight in non-binary categories early, a sort of clamping down in the middle, and then that sort of comes back again, with a sort of play and fluidity again in the 14th and 15th century. But as other historians have looked at the periods after, there's another tightening up period that comes up again, and then another loosening period. So I think what we see when we look at like the big picture is there's just no one way of dividing up people and one way of talking about them. But these issues are always kind of at the heart of struggles for power over inheritance, over rulership, over, kind of like medical and legal descriptions of like who fits in where, who can inherit, who can marry whom, who can be like an heir, So it never isn't a part of the dominant discourse, right? Although I think attentiveness to it and kind of like ubiquity of it does sort of like fade in and out depending on when it becomes more important and more, kind of the hot topic that, that politics revolves around.
Yeah, there's a hand there, and then I'm going to go up there. So it's too long. Too long from you. Hang on. Oh, hang on. Just too long from you. There's somebody here. Hang on. Sorry. Forward. I'll put it down there. Yeah.
Hiya, yeah. On a personal note, I want to say thank you very much. You've been a big inspiration for me going into gender studies. But I also wanted to ask about, you've sort of set out two competing sort of ideas about non-binary ness, where there's sort of the idea of the female to male saints and that sort of positive idea, and also the othering. And how does one try and reconcile these ideas, or does one even want to?
Yeah. Although I do think I kind of set it up this way, I kind of want to step back a little bit from saying like negative and positive, because I think that, othering is working with non-binary sex and gender, but in a lot of different kinds of ways here, right? I mean, we can't say, in a sense, like the othering is still happening in the non-binary saints, right? Or in Adam as non-binary, or the angels as non-binary, right? I mean, part of what makes them so rarefied, right, is they're not like regular humans, right? So here, like othering, it is not like a violence, right? But it's still, I think that here and there, that kind of like ordinary and beyond extraordinary is still being invoked, right? And I think that, these become ways of theorizing about human existence, because they don't have like gender theory, right? They don't have like critical race theory. What they have is like, I can imagine a place different from here, Now maybe that's paradise, maybe that's like the resurrection, or maybe it's Africa, right? And those become kind of thought experiments for thinking about what we have here, right? And what might other possibilities be, right? In kind of like a fantastic place. So I wouldn't want to say it's exactly positive or negative. It's just like a whole host of ways that people during this time period worked out these ideas about what it meant to be human in the ways that were important to them.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's two hands up there. And, yeah, if you could go back. 4 rows. Oh, no, it's okay. Another mic's coming. Thank you.
Hello.
Oh.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, the person next to you had a hand up first, and then I'll have to. Yeah. And then thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. I think my question is quite similar to the last one, so I'll keep it brief. But
Okay.
I'm really fascinated by especially seeing both the Christ and Antichrist depicted here as being non-binary. And I was wondering if in these sources there is any kind of discourse about there being a satanic or demonic component sometimes to non-binary or intersex individuals. I'm sure I've read something about later early modern witchcraft prosecutions, for example, facing accusations of like removing male genitalia or being able to change people's gender through demonic means. I'm sure I've come across that somewhere. And again, it's just fascinating to me how you can reconcile those two ideas of the saintly sort of non-binary figure versus if there was some kind of association with the demonic as well.
Yeah, thanks for that question. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. Not only was there a kind of sense of angels as being sort of transcending differences between male and female, but like in the cosmology we have here, angels and demons are actually the same kind of creature, right? So since angels do it, so do demons, right? So demons, they don't have a firm division of male and female, right? And so that's part of what, again, makes them kind of like beyond, like the human category. So, not to get like too like in the weeds, but there's a lot of different like legends of kind of sex-changing demons, right? Or there's kind of like imaginations that demons appear in like a male form and sometimes have sex with women, and then switch and have in a female form and have sex with men. And so that's kind of like part of the horror of them is they can like switch back and forth. And they have this kind of unfixity, right? It works in a different way from the angels, but it still speaks to these kind of categories, either like lower or higher, kind of superhuman, as being not held by the same kind of categories that humans might be fixed to in certain times.
Okay, and then next to you. Sorry about that.
No, I apologize. And thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate the message on the importance of history, especially to determining the present and the future for people. But for context, I am from the Balkans, which is a very like religious area in Europe, and popular folktale there is of a female warrior that gets converted through the divine to male to be able to marry a princess, like her love interest. And that's seen and that's showcased in like a religious context as like a reward for her devotion. And I was kind of curious, current like religious institutions have already had hundreds of years with this history to prepare either arguments or to basically get control of the entire narrative, and how should like historians take that into account moving forward, especially with such an important topic?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and there are certainly medieval romances that have some of these similar kind of stories, right, where someone like is able to change genders to receive like a romance, or so I think that there's some of that fluidity in the romance genre in Western Europe as well. But I'm not sure I quite understood the question about historians.
It's more the fact that I could see it in the modern context as well, where somebody's trying to present this history, basically trying to argue that like non-binary people or gender fluid people have already existed, which is the case, and then somebody using the religious interpretation of those like stories or text as an argument against it, basically, because they like the religious institution, especially at the time, had more time to prepare for this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm not aware that anybody's making those kinds of arguments, right? But I mean, I think arguments there that are, you know, like non-binary people have been scapegoated in the past, hence it's okay now, you know, maybe aren't going to have so much valence. But I think, you know, that I think it's helpful for us, you know, thinking historically is you know, recognizing that there's significant differences always when we look, but that we can also recognize certain kinds of patterns and see examples where, for instance, you know, arguing that because people are, you know, gender transitioning or, you know, don't fit into you know, one of these categories, that they're somehow deserving of violence or not deserving of kind of the ethical protections that are afforded to humans. That's something that I think that we need to be really attentive to, and any historian that would use that as kind of like a rationale for why it's okay now, I think that that's a hard argument to, you know, to accept. But you know, let's I guess have that argument then, you know, and I think we can make a defense of it.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, now, just as I'm thinking, we ought to come in. All these hands are going up.
Oh no, I was
yeah.
going to say, I mean, please, you know, I think we have a minute to stick around. I know
Yeah.
that we won't get to all of the questions. I'm
Okay.
happy to speak to people afterwards or beyond.
I've got 3 hands. I'm going to take the 3 questions, and then you can maybe
Do you want to
sum
do
up.
like
Yeah, I'm
3
just
at
gonna
a
take,
time, and then
yes, just
okay.
so can we start with somebody standing up at the back there, Flav, and then the hand here, and then Roz, and then we'll just take them together, and you can see how you answer them. Or
Great. Thank you for that. That was very interesting. I 2 quick questions. First, historical, just about your archive. I was just curious. I'm much more familiar with the archives of sodomy in the medieval ages, and your talk made me wonder, is the sodomite a non-binary figure, or is the non-binary figure a sodomite? So I was just curious about your archives because of the monstrosity of the sodomite, the fact that there's this kind of half beast, half human, the fact that the body is being used in a womanly way, and so I was just curious as to what your historical sources say. And then contemporaneously, the question is, I get why historians want to say that there are these continuities, and I think it's an important project given the context in which people are trying to deny the history. But I'm just curious, what are the differences? Like, if we acknowledge the historical continuities of non-binarism, is there something you see that's actually unique in our late 20th century, early 21st century around non-binarism today that actually marks it as something distinct?
Okay, I think I might have to answer
Yes,
that,
you
but
can
I'll
answer
forget
that,
it
yeah.
before the next question
then-
comes.
and maybe you
Okay,
can
first
give it
on the
Flav.
sodomy question, sure, sort of like intensive authoritative discourse on sodomy becomes much more intense during the same time period that these non-binary figures are appearing, and in a number of the texts, sodomites are described as hermaphrodites, or doing something sodomitically is described as acting like a hermaphrodite. And often the issue in terms of the arguments about sodomy and some of the persecutions in sodomy are about gender inversion, right? The idea that the person who is the sodomite is a man who had sex like a woman, right? So I think that it's important to kind of recognize that the gender inversion, the kind of like transness, is always not always, but often at the heart of those sodomy issues as well, and those are really kind of united. Okay, remind me of the next question. It was, what's different? Well, okay, you know, I mean, when I'm talking about non-binary here, and they're using the term non-binary, they're not using it in the same way that, you know, someone in the 21st century is identifying as non-binary gender, right? I mean, it's the same term, but certainly it has a kind of historical variation. Even if we're using the same term, we can recognize that it means different things to, like, Rolandino, right, who's talking about really an intersex person. Intersex people generally don't, I mean, some identify as non-binary, but certainly not all, right? Those aren't kind of like equivalent categories now. I mean, and same with trans and non-binary. When you ask like 10 trans people, like the relationship between non-binary and trans, you're gonna get 10 different answers, right? So, you know, I think that there are language and categories probably everywhere, but certainly in kind of like queer and trans circles are moving incredibly quickly, right? Like something that you like learned or heard like, you know, 6 months ago isn't going to be right today. So I think that, I mean, that uniqueness is reasserting itself constantly, right? In the way that people are laying out identities and new words and new relationships between the kind of different umbrella terms that we use. So, I mean, I think that each of these different periods, they share continuities, but each are unique and completely tied to all the different kind of historic issues of their moment.
Okay, I had one there, and then Ros, and then I'm going to...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask about what you think the place or significance of marriage is within the story, especially because I know that in your book you point out that often when kind of real life cases of intersex individuals emerge, it's through marital annulment cases, but then also kind of bringing in the theoretical point that you made, for instance, about Adam and Eve, which is another kind of form of marriage.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, and you kind of give me like a good way into an answer. I mean, for one thing, as you say, like the kind of like creation story and the legend of Adam and Eve is a part of kind of the rationale of all kinds of hierarchies, included the marriage hierarchy and marriage contract, but also the relationship between, you know, adherent and church, and like individual and kingdom, right? So, you know, the way that these myths get told and how the hierarchies exist in them are crucially important for how people are shaping social categories of all kinds, including marriage during the time period. And then you point to the other thing, which I also really want to point up, which is the individual cases, which I didn't talk about so much today, because I wanted to focus on images, and most of them are just brief snippets of text. The individual cases that we have for this period almost all come to us because of like the worst day that person ever had in their life, right? It's either it's kind of like in a carceral context or a medical context, a marriage dissolution or a fight over some kind of inheritance, you know, and so marriage is crucially the point at which most of these cases come into view in the archive, and when they obviously, you know, came into conflict with people's lives, right? People being sued for annulment or divorce because they were considered to be, you know, not sexually acceptable, right? They were described as being like eunuchs or hermaphrodites or impotent or something like that, and that's how we get kind of the medical case that gives us their lives. You know, these cases are very voyeuristic in a lot of instances, and frequently, you know, we don't really get the first person account from the individual in question. We get like a very mediated court case or medical case, and so I think that it's not only, you know, points to where, you know, marriage is like the kind of hinge issue that you know, where sex and gender become, you know, apparent, but also speak to kind of like our work as historians and trying to illuminate these histories through what are really difficult cases and difficult ethical issues with how we use them, right? Sort of like, you know, revealing these people's lives in ways that kind of expose them in a, you know, in kind of a sad and painful way. And those become, you know, things that we have to work with as historians, because often they're the only stories that we have, but ones that, you know, I think that we have to be really sensitive to in thinking about the real historical people who are in the records.
Last one.
So, yeah, I want to keep it brief. I think my question is about the relationship you see between the history of sexualities and the history of genders. So I suppose I was thinking as you were talking that one way that I might define trans or non-binary politics in the present as new would be to say that it's a politics that doesn't define itself in the way that historically we've tended to talk. So either in terms of the nature of who you love or the nature of what you do, so that we have historically, the history of sexualities has been a history of practices that have been defined, that have defined people, sodomy or whatever, or a history of an attraction or a connection to someone whose nature is or a being whose nature is fixed. Whereas it seems to me that trans politics has often been about saying, this is neither of these things. This is about how you love yourself, or about a kind of a self-care, or how you identify yourself, and you shouldn't be defined by either of those ways of thinking about being. So I'm wondering whether you feel in what you've done that you're hearing that kind of what we might now call self-determination, which seems to me often what's being pushed back against in that you can hear in the kind of American politics we're hearing now. You do not have the right to define yourself, or we will take that right away with you, or we will, So it's that nexus that I'm interested in. Partly about where you would place yourself in that
gender
story.
is distinct from sexuality, and gender in terms of self-representation or self-identification. I mean, it's a really complex question, and it's hard to do it justice in this way, but I will say that in speaking to the question about what might be different, in terms of continuity, I mean, one thing they didn't have was a separability of sexuality and gender during this period. I mean, they just didn't even have separate words for it. The word sexus in Latin meant both of those things, from our point of view, right? In terms of both kind of like body and the behavior that stems from the body and the sexuality that was attached to that particular role. They rolled that all up, just like that Legend of Monstrous Races, into like kind of one word. So you're right that in the 21st century, we, at least in some cases, have a kind of more separable idea of gender and sexuality. But I would also say that I don't know if that's 100% true either. There's certain times when the separability of sex and gender is helpful, right? Transgender identification, kind of thinking about a dissonance between body and gender is one way maybe it seems to be helpful. But in other ways, I think, when we get into some of the ways that people assign sex, for instance, gender is crucially kind of within those assignments, right? I mean, think in terms of intersex, where like, will this person perform better as female or male? That's going to help us to identify, what's the proper sex. I mean, I think gender is actually really included in sex. And I think in terms of queer and trans stuff, sexuality is still kind of at play in certain kinds of gender identification. So I think it seems like it could be clear-cut, but it's actually messier than that, even in the present. But I think your point about self-identification is true to the extent we know, right? Because we just don't have that many records that give us insight into people's self-identifications, in this pre-1500 moment. But also, I mean, this is a historian's thing, right? Yes, this, but then I can think of, but, I think of, for instance, the case of Eleanor Reichner, who is a case from the 14th century from London, a sex worker who actually was just in the British Library medieval women show, if you made it, anyways, is now sometimes considered to be like a trans woman. And the little snippet that we have from the court case, she seems to identify, I mean, she does seem to, she said, if they say this person calling herself Eleanor, right? So there's almost like this little hint of a sense of an identity to the extent that we can grasp it, from the 21st century. So I don't know that we can say that what's unique about our period is this strong sense of like, I am this, or, this is my identification. It could be that, that's something that we can just barely grasp, but was there in the past too.
Okay, thank you, Leah, for a really wonderful talk, and I think for reminding us also what history does, which is to look at what's strange across time and what we find different or challenging, and kind of denaturalize what people think now, which
Absolutely.
is just, I think that's the lesson, isn't it? A direct lesson. And thank you all for your time, for coming along, and for your amazing attention and brilliant questions. Next week is the last week of term. It's the last talk of term. We have Mansfield alum Martha Swales, who's just written a book which has just come out about gardening for everyone in all sorts of spaces. It's called Give It a Grow. Come along if you'd like to. Otherwise, look for the programme for next term. And thank you all very much for coming. And thank you.
Thanks so much for coming.